Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 312 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about terminal lucidity. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
If you live long enough, you will lose loved ones. Sometimes people lose a loved one suddenly through an unexpected death, and they have no chance to say goodbye. Other times, they lose a loved one after a long, slow decline, perhaps even a slide into dementia, where the loved one's mind gradually erodes. This also makes it hard to say goodbye. It's hard to say goodbye early because the person will still be with you for a long time, but if you say goodbye late, the loved one may not understand it or be able to say goodbye to you either. As a result, many people feel like they never really got to say farewell to some of the people they love most. But wouldn't it be great if, just one last time, the loved one came back to themselves before they die? They had full command of their faculties, and you finally had the chance to tell them how much you love them and say farewell? Well, that's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Now, we often begin by noting whether one of us has a personal connection with the mystery we're going to be discussing, and today's mystery involves the tragic phenomenon of dementia. I should mention that my mother died a little over a year ago, and she suffered with dementia in her last years. It was a slow decline, and basically, there was no real ability to communicate in a meaningful way in the last 6 months of her life, so I already have a first-hand connection with some of what we'll discuss. Jimmy, have you had any connection with dementia?
Well, thank God I'm not demented myself, and the signs are good that I won't be. None of my relatives have had dementia. But I have known and worked with people who have had dementia. Back when I was in college in the 1980s, I worked for a newspaper, the Northwest Arkansas Times, both as a paper carrier and as the complaints department, which meant that I delivered papers that had failed to be delivered by other drivers. And in this capacity, I got to know some people that had dementia in different degrees. One was a woman who had just moved into a private apartment in an assisted living facility, and it was clear that she was in a somewhat early stage of dementia because at first she knew who I was, but then she forgot who I was and she would get suspicious and paranoid when I'd show up. And I could tell that she was still suspicious even when I reintroduced myself and explained why I was there. On Sundays, I also brought editions of the Sunday paper to a local nursing home for the residents, and some of them just sat there in wheelchairs, not moving or saying a word. I remember one woman in particular who would always be waiting for the paper in her wheelchair, and she would kind of clumsily gesture for the paper, but she never said anything, at least not in my presence. Though I was told once that someone had violated her personal space, and she immediately came alive and started telling the person to get away from her and take their hands off her. But she would normally just sit there not saying anything. It was a strange experience for me, but it gave me a taste of what people who have to care for those experiencing dementia, including their loved ones, have to go through. And dementia itself is a real tragedy that robs a person of so much. But the good news we'll hear today is that there can also be hope.
So where do you want to begin today's mystery?
I want to start with a concept that will be important later in our discussion. There's a long-running question about where consciousness comes from. One view is known as substance dualism, and it holds that the mind or consciousness is something fundamentally different from our brains and bodies. There are two different substances on this view. A major alternative is known as materialistic monism, and it holds that mind or consciousness isn't an independent substance. On this view, the only substance that actually exists is the matter that our brains and bodies are made out of. There are other views too, but these are the ones that we'll be looking at today. According to materialistic monism, mind and consciousness is something that is generated by our brains. So when we die and our brains go permanently offline, we cease to have mind and consciousness. We're just worm food at that point. By contrast, substance dualism holds that since our minds aren't made of the same stuff our bodies are, our minds or consciousnesses continue to exist when the body dies.
Obviously, many religious people are going to favor substance dualism over materialism, but is there any way to decide between these options based on reason alone without appealing to matters of faith?
It's a very interesting question, and the answer is potentially yes. However, a lot of materialists today just assume that the historic view of substance dualism is wrong and that materialism has been proved by science. They may even appeal to recent findings in neuroscience to back up this claim. But it's not true. Neither neuroscience nor any other branch of science has proved that materialism is true. In fact, the natural sciences are not capable of proving materialism is true because at present, the only things the natural sciences can detect are things made out of matter. So if all you can, or, energy, matter, same thing. So if all you can detect is stuff made out of matter, then you can't prove that matter is the only thing there is because you have no way of detecting other things. And you can't prove or disprove things you're unable to detect with the means you have available to you.
Then why do some materialists appeal to neuroscience as a way of arguing against substance dualism?
Because there have been discoveries that link what's happening in our brains to our minds, but that's not a surprise. We've known for a long time that people think with their brains. However, that wasn't always the case. Some in the ancient world thought that we think in our hearts, which makes a kind of sense because when you get excited, your heartbeat speeds up, so you can feel it. And that, seems like evidence for a connection between the mind and the heart. But eventually, centuries ago, it was realized that we actually think with our brains. So it's not a surprise when modern neuroscience starts showing us things like functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRIs, that reveal portions of people's brains lighting up when they think or do stuff. That's what you'd expect if there's a special connection between the mind and the brain. There have been other findings as well. For example, in September of 1848, there was a 25-year-old man named Phineas Gage who was working as a railroad foreman in Vermont. They did a lot of blasting with explosive charges to clear paths for the railroad, and one day, Gage was using an iron rod to tamp down an explosive into a hole that had been drilled when the iron rod caused a spark that set off the explosive, and it blew the iron rod up through the left portion of Gage's skull. Miraculously, Gage survived the incident, but according to some, his personality was drastically altered. For example, here's an account written by Dr. John Harlow, who knew Gage before the accident and treated him after it.
The equilibrium or balance, so to speak, between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities seems to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times pertinaciously obstinate, yet capricious and vacillating, devising many plans of future operations, which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned in turn for others appearing more feasible. A child in his intellectual capacity and manifestations, he has the animal passions of a strong man. Previous to his injury, although untrained in the schools, he possessed a well-balanced mind, and was looked upon by those who knew him as a shrewd, smart businessman, very energetic and persistent in executing all his plans of operation. In this regard, his mind was radically changed, so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage.
Based on Harlow's description, many people have argued that such a radical personality change would indicate that mental function is highly dependent on the brain, and thus that the brain generates the mind.
How strong is Gage's case considered today in light of modern science?
Actually, there's been widespread criticism of relying on Gage's case too much. Even in the 19th century, physicians used it to try to justify competing claims. For example, at the time, the science of phrenology was very popular. We talked about phrenology back in episode 229 and again in episode 230. These dealt with the 19th century figure, the Seventh-day Prophetess Ellen Gould White. So you can go to mysterious.fm/229 and mysterious.fm/230 for more. But phrenology held that mental functions and personality traits are closely tied with particular parts of the brain, and you could even use the bumps on a person's head to figure out which of their brain regions were highly developed and thus what the individual's personality and abilities would be like. Today, phrenology is commonly said to be a pseudoscience, but it really would be more accurate. That's just kind of being impolite. It really would be more accurate to say that it's a scientific theory that has been falsified. But it was a lively subject of debate in the 19th century, and both phrenologists and non-phrenologists would appeal to Phineas Gage to support their positions. In fact, Dr. Harlow, who treated him, seems to have been interested in phrenology. In any event, modern scientific authors have often concluded that we shouldn't make too much of the Phineas Gage case because we really don't know enough about it. For example, we don't have tests of Gage's personality and mental function before and after the accident. All we have are a handful of anecdotes, and because the case was so sensationalized, we can't have a lot of confidence in its details. And also because it was used to prove opposing points of view, meaning it didn't clearly support one view over another. However, it does still get appealed to by some authors as evidence in the mind-brain discussion.
If you're a substance dualist, how surprising is it that physical factors like changes in the brain, including what happened with Phineas Gage, would have an effect on how your mind operates?
Actually, it wouldn't be surprising at all. People have known all the way through human history that physical things can have an effect on mental function, and substance dualists take this into account. For example, people have known that if you ingest certain substances like alcohol, it will affect how your mind works. You get drunk and your thinking gets fuzzy, your emotions change, and you start losing bodily coordination and get clumsy. So thoughtful substance dualists have recognized that there is a close connection between mind and brain, and that physical changes can affect mental function. But that doesn't prove that the brain generates the mind. Here's an example I recently ran across from Professor Alexander Bathiani in his book Threshold, Terminal Lucidity and the Border of Life and Death. He points out that at least in many cases, poets have used pencils to write their poems. So you could see having a functional pencil as a condition for a poet to write a poem. But nobody would argue that the pencil is the cause of the poem, or the pen or word processor, or whatever the poet happens to be using. The cause of the poem is the poet. He just needs something to write with. In the same way, you may need a functioning brain when you're thinking conscious thoughts in this life, but that doesn't mean that the brain is the ultimate cause of consciousness any more than it means a pencil is the ultimate cause of a poem. Sure, if I damage your brain so that it's not functioning properly, it may stop you from thinking properly, just like if I break a poet's pencil, it may stop him from writing a poem. But in neither case does this show us that the physical instrument that's being used is the ultimate cause of what's happening. Essentially, all modern neuroscience is capable of doing is revealing the neural pathways, the pencils that we use when we think. But there's no way to prove that there isn't a separate mind or self using those pathways if you can only detect matter and energy and thus can't detect a mind.
Is there a way we might go about figuring out that issue from the perspective of reason?
Potentially, yes. And this gets us to a very interesting area that's going to lead us to the mystery of terminal lucidity, or TL. One of the things that Dr. Bathiani points out in his book is that in many situations in life, we have our mental function affected in various ways, but as long as an individual's personality returns to its normal functioning at some point, we feel that there is a stable self that was inside the person all along, and we distinguish the momentary interruptions of mental function from who they really are. For example, every day, each one of us loses consciousness. That happens when we go to sleep. But we don't regard that as affecting someone's identity. When they wake up, they're their same old self. Similarly, if someone gets drunk or high, their mental function and personality may be affected. But when they sober up, they're their same old self again. Or if they catch a fever and start hallucinating, their mind is affected, but when they recover from the fever and stop hallucinating, they're back to normal. Or if they get a brain tumor and it affects their mental function, but then they get surgery and have the brain tumor successfully removed, then once again, their normal self is back. So long as the person's normal self returns at some point, we regard this as evidence for a stable, enduring self, what you might call the person's soul in religious terms. The question comes with conditions that don't improve. Some people get dementia or other permanent brain conditions that seem to leave them forever being someone else, like when Phineas Gage, at least reportedly, was no longer Gage after his accident. And these can lead people to question substance dualism. In Threshold, Professor Bathiani writes,
The Austro-American philosopher Paul Edwards illustrates these implications with the example of Mrs. D, an elderly lady of his acquaintance. Mrs. D was a wealthy woman from Virginia, a banker's widow. Edwards describes her as an exceptionally elegant, benevolent, generous, cultured, and kind, and continues, I do not know what her attitude toward paralyzed or disabled people was, but I assume that she surely had empathy with them, and certainly no desire to beat them up. When Mrs. D fell ill with Alzheimer's disease and her condition progressively deteriorated, she was moved to a nursing home. She shared her room with an elderly paralyzed woman confined to a wheelchair. During the first year in the nursing home, Mrs. D remained calm, if forgetful and confused, but thereafter grew increasingly aggressive and violent. Then she started hitting the nurses. At about that time, she could no longer recognize her daughter, and she beat up the paralyzed lady on 2 or 3 occasions, which resulted in her transfer to a special ward for particularly challenging and violent patients. Edwards doesn't merely cite this case in order to describe the drama of dementia. Rather, he's concerned with something altogether different, namely that adherence to the old-fashioned dualism, which maintains that the true essence of a person is not its neurological machinery but an immaterial soul, is no longer sustainable, given what dementia and other such diseases tell us about the dependence of the mind on the brain. Edwards draws a conclusion that is as simple as its implications are sobering. Mrs. D's pronounced behavioral changes were clearly due to her illness. A dualist might argue that her true individual identity, Mrs. D's self, or to use the older religious term, her soul, was still that of an amiable, kind, and considerate Mrs. D, the person she had been before her illness. That supposition presumes that her soul was not actually lost, but merely inaccessible, hidden, or concealed somewhere within her. Therefore, one would have to argue that Mrs. D, somewhere in her innermost self, actually recognized her daughter, but was prevented by her illness from communicating as much, and that she really had no intention of beating the nurses, let alone her fellow patient, but was somehow compelled to do so by her disorder. Edwards reaches a different and seemingly compelling conclusion. Mrs. D behaved amiably, graciously, reasonably, and normally, precisely as long as and because her brain functioned normally. Only in the course of the disease's progress did her behavior grow more uncharacteristic of her old self, and as the disease progressed further still, the old Mrs. D vanished entirely. Her old self, her real and pre-morbid self, if you will, was lost, died, while her body was still alive. And this, according to Edwards, implies in more general terms that our self, our consciousness, our individuality, in short, we, are ultimately no more than the product of brain activity. And this conclusion applies not just to the dementia patient, Mrs. D, but also to the now lost, previously healthy Mrs. D, or you and me. Edwards writes, if there was a soul, brain damage could not also damage our emotional feelings, but it does. If memory, behavior, and emotions are all controlled by the physical brain, what is the soul for? Modern science proves that the idea of souls is misguided. Everything is biological.
So that's Edwards' argument. Permanent neurological changes like those that happened to Mrs. D after she got Alzheimer's show that the idea of an enduring self or soul is misguided. And in reality, everything is really biological, which is to say everything is material. The brain is what actually generates the mind and personality. But is that really true? Or is there evidence that deep within people like Mrs. D who have dementia, their longtime stable self is still really there? That brings us to the subject of terminal lucidity, or TL.
So what is terminal lucidity?
It doesn't have a universally agreed upon definition, but here's a provisional definition of both terminal lucidity and a related phenomenon known as paradoxical lucidity that was offered by G.A. Masur and Alexander Bettinelli.
Paradoxical lucidity and terminal lucidity involve an episode of unexpected, spontaneous, meaningful, and relevant communication or connectedness in a patient who is assumed to have permanently lost the capacity for coherent verbal or behavioral interaction due to a progressive and pathophysiologic dementing process.
So to unpack that a little, terminal lucidity occurs when a person has become progressively more demented due to a biological process going on in their body, and they've lost the ability to have coherent verbal or behavioral interactions with other people, but then unexpectedly, they spontaneously regain the ability to have meaningful and relevant communications or connectedness with others. So that's a basic definition of the two phenomena.
And what's the difference between them?
How close to the lucidity happens to be to the person's death. If it occurs shortly before their death, like a few minutes, hours, or days before they die, then it's called terminal lucidity because their life is about to terminate when the lucidity occurs. But if it happens and they don't die, at least for a lengthy period, then it's called paradoxical lucidity, since it's an unexpected, unexplained paradox why their ability to communicate suddenly returns and it isn't close to when their life terminates.
When did you first hear about terminal lucidity?
The phrase didn't exist until just a few years ago, around 2009. It was coined by the German biologist Dr. Michael Nahm. But I believe that I first heard about it in 2021 when a patron of Mysterious World asked me to comment on it for one of our Patrons' Questions episodes. So I did some research. Later, in the classes I've been taking at the Rhine Education Center, the subject also has come up repeatedly because it's a phenomenon that happens in proximity to death, making it meaningful for parapsychologists to study it and see whether it may have a bearing on the scientific study of whether we survive our deaths. Human survival, together with psychic functioning, being the two principal areas that parapsychology studies.
Why did it take so long for terminal lucidity to get a name?
It seems to have been for several reasons. It turns out that if you dig into the historical record, you actually find references to TL going back hundreds of years. Alexander Bettinelli writes,
Researchers Michael Nahm and Bruce Grayson have, in the course of their extensive literature research, found more than 80 such case histories in the older medical literature of the last 250 years. The majority of these cases were described before the end of the 19th century. Only a few works on the subject of terminal lucidity appeared thereafter. But as Sandy McLeod points out in a brief historical overview, TL also found its way into the chronicles of art and cultural history, such as the case of Queen Dagmar of Denmark, 13th century, who was in a coma yet briefly awoke at her deathbed as her husband King Valdemar returned from a hunting trip. The story became legend and was later painted by Georg van Rosen in 1898. And when Russian writer Alexander Pushkin died of sepsis of his injuries incurred in a pistol duel, he encountered, according to the attending physician, one of those sudden turns for the better that is so illusory of fatal illness, shortly before his death.
Similarly, in his article on terminal lucidity in the Science Encyclopedia, Michael Nahm writes,
Early physicians such as Hippocrates, Plutarch, Cicero, Galen, Avicenna, and other scholars of classical times note that symptoms of mental disorders sometimes decrease as death approaches. This was also observed in the 19th century. Several cases of different etiology were published in the early medical literature, also in treatises written by authors who proclaimed a romantic and post-romantic understanding of nature, embracing the notion that the human soul is separate from the brain and can survive bodily death. In the 20th century, discussions and case reports of terminal lucidity declined and are almost absent in the medical literature of the period. However, some reports continued to be published outside the medical setting. Since the turn of the millennium, they have again become more frequent in the medical literature, as a survey of the past 250 years has shown. Case summaries of this survey have been published predominantly by biologist Michael Naum and colleagues. In short, it appears that incidents of terminal lucidity have occurred throughout the history of humanity on all continents.
So terminal lucidity seems to be a universal phenomenon, and in older literature, we get references to cases of what would now be called terminal lucidity, but they stopped being reported for much of the 20th century, possibly due to a change in medical writing styles. Originally, case reports would be fuller and more descriptive of what happened with a patient, but later they began to be written in a terse, Joe Friday, just the facts style, only listing things like the patient's age, sex, and cause of death without a big description of what happened right before they died. Also, in the 20th century, we started learning more about dementia and what causes it, and at the same time, the idea that the brain generates the mind was really taking off. So doctors were more skeptical of the idea that one could suddenly, instantaneously recover from dementia. Then there's the fact that by the 20th century, doctors weren't spending a lot of time with their patients. They might come by for only a few minutes a day, and so they might not be there when the patient regained their mental faculties, and their skepticism would keep them from taking the reports of others seriously. On the other hand, nurses spend more time with the patients, and in Threshold, Bettinelli quotes one nurse commenting on the idea that these reports of miraculous recoveries from dementia were just a historical phenomenon due to outdated medical practice. She said,
"Us nurses, we know this. We always say, the last glow has begun. Only the week before last we had a case like this on the ward. Historical, my foot."
And eventually enough contemporary cases started to get noticed that doctors began to think about them. And in 2009, a trio of papers were published on the study, in one of which Michael Naum coined the term for the phenomenon.
What was your initial impression of TL after you first heard of it?
I found it interesting, and I recognized how powerfully meaningful it can be for those whose loved ones experience it. I mean, wow, it's given a lot of people the chance to say a final goodbye to their loved ones when they thought they'd never be able to do that, and that's a great blessing. I know I'd be incredibly moved if that happened with me and someone I love. When it came to whether this phenomenon tells us anything about human survival, I've been cautious, because I could see how TL by itself could be a purely natural biological phenomenon. Our bodies are programmed to try to survive. That's part of our evolutionary imperative. And we have self-regulating processes in our bodies to try to keep things on an even keel to allow us to survive. For example, that's why our bodies release insulin when our blood sugar starts getting too high. Elevated blood sugar can do damage to us, which is why diabetes can even be fatal if you don't treat it. So when our blood sugar gets too high, our bodies are supposed to release insulin to yank the blood sugar back down to an acceptable level. We have an inbuilt reflex to release insulin in those situations, and diabetes is what occurs when something stops that process from happening the way it should. Well, I could imagine that when a person is really close to death and different systems in our bodies are breaking down, it might set off some kind of massive last-minute reflex in an attempt to get things back on an even keel and let us survive. And improved mental function might be a side effect of that reflex going off. At least that was one of the first things that occurred to me when considering terminal lucidity from a scientific perspective. Whether that's actually the case, though, is something that we need to look at more closely with TL to figure out.
Then let's look at some case histories of terminal lucidity so that we can get a better idea of what happens. Where would you like to start?
With Alexander Bettinelli's own experience with his grandmother, which prompted his interest in the topic.
I was still a student at the University of Vienna when the following happened several years before the first articles on the subject of TL were published. My grandmother suffered from what was most likely cardiovascular dementia. In her last year, she was hardly able to speak and no longer capable of initiating a conversation or adequately answering even simple questions. Yet, one day, my mother phoned and asked me to immediately call my grandmother in Geneva, Switzerland. She said, "We just had a wonderful conversation. I don't know what happened, but you should call." I call my grandmother and she answers the phone. She sounds tired and gentle, but she is perfectly clear and as gracious, caring, and affectionate as she used to be before her health declined. She greets me, we talk, and I thank her for the wonderful days we children spent with our grandparents in Geneva, where my mother's parents moved from Germany in order to escape the war and the collective madness that befell Germany during the Nazi reign. She in turn thanks me and my brother for the many beautiful experiences we shared together. "You brought so much joy to our lives," she almost whispers. "But no, you brought so much joy and warmth to ours. Thank you." And we talk about the wonderful memories we share. I had so many reasons to thank her. Then she moves to the present day. She knows why she is taken care of by the nurses, and she adds that she's been very tired over the past months and that she hardly remembers them at all. Our conversation lasts some 10 minutes. She's perfectly lucid throughout, doesn't show a trace of confusion or forgetfulness. In short, during our conversation, she is once more the gentle and affectionate and warm grandmother I remembered from my childhood and adolescent days, and was now allowed to experience once more. Once more meeting her old self, herself. On the one hand, that whole episode was wonderful. On the other, it was heartrending, because I now believe both of us, sensed at the time that this gift of spending time together, if only on the phone, would be transient, and the conversation our last. It was.
And of course, Bathiani's experience is far from the only one. Here's another experience. This time, we're going to be looking at an example from Bathiani's own case files, and it occurred in 2019 to an elderly German lady with Alzheimer's disease. Her daughter reports,
"My mother had advanced Alzheimer's. She no longer recognized us, and she didn't even seem to care who these strangers were visiting her once or twice a week. On the day before her passing, however, everything was different. Not only did she recognize us, she wanted to know what had happened in the course of the past year for every one of us, delighting in good news and shedding the odd tear over bad news, just as this affectionate, motherly woman had done before her dementia. Her comments were as wise and caring as ever. When she heard that my younger daughter had recently broken off her engagement and descended into a deep depression, she asked her to stay with her for a while afterward, because she wanted to talk to her in private. My daughter never told me what she discussed with my mother, but it was a turning point for her. When we took our leave, we didn't know what to expect next. Was she miraculously healed of her dementia? With hindsight, however, I believe that my siblings and me understood that she knew exactly that she didn't have long to live. She said goodbye to every one of us, held our hands, stroking them with her thumb, just as she had done when we were children. She was, I can't think of another way to say this, simply her old self. Sadly, it wasn't meant to last. She died the same night.
So this was a case where a woman seemed to spontaneously recover from the dementia that Alzheimer's disease causes. But terminal lucidity also applies to cases where people are mentally incapacitated from other causes and from a wide variety of different causes. Here's an example from the year 2012 that was reported by researcher Michael Nahm, and it deals with a man who is incapacitated because of a brain tumor. Nahm and his colleagues write,
In a case recently reported to us, a 42-year-old investment manager had a grand mal seizure out of the blue one night. Although his EEG showed generalized slowing, repeated MRIs appeared normal. 2 months later, however, a repeat MRI showed a plum-sized glioblastoma multiforme. By the time he had surgery 2 weeks later, the tumor had doubled in size and a second had formed in his speech center. Following 2 surgical excisions, gamma knife radiation, intrathecal chemotherapy, and steroids, he was able to go back to work part-time. However, the tumor soon recurred, and after a failed trial of an experimental oral chemotherapy agent, he declined further treatment and enrolled in hospice care in his home. He quickly became bedridden, blind in one eye, incontinent, and increasingly incoherent in his speech and bizarre in his behavior. He appeared to be unable to make sense of his surroundings, and when his family touched him, he would slap as if at an insect. He eventually stopped sleeping, talking deliriously throughout the night. After several weeks of that, he suddenly, one night, appeared calm and started speaking coherently, and then slept peacefully. The following morning, he remained coherent and conversed with his wife, discussing his imminent death with her for the first time. However, he stopped speaking later that day and lay immobile in his bed, not eating or drinking for 2 more weeks, after which he expired after several hours of status epilepticus.
Finally, among the recent cases that we're going to consider, here's an example provided by New Zealand researcher Sandy McLeod as part of a study he did in 2009.
A 72-year-old retired electrician presented the previous year with persistent cough. Chest X-ray indicated a lung lesion, which was determined to be non-small cell carcinoma. 6 months after a lobectomy, he suffered an epileptic seizure. Whole brain irradiation palliated the symptoms of cerebral metastases, that is, of the cancer spreading, for a further 6 months, at which time he developed an uncontrollable series of major seizures and left upper limb weakness. Corticosteroids and anticonvulsants promptly relieved the cerebral symptoms and signs, though within weeks his neurology had progressed. On admission to the hospice, he was aphasic, meaning unable to communicate verbally, doubly incontinent, had a dense hemiplegia, and had fitted the previous night. He could no longer comply with his oral medications. A parenteral, that is subcutaneous regime, of midazolam to replace oral phenytoin, morphine for chest pain, dexamethasone, and haloperidol for nausea was introduced. His clinical state settled for 36 hours, though the neurological signs only partially remitted. Then, remarkably, he regained speech and became alert and verbally responsive to his family. Within 12 hours, he lapsed into a coma and died the following day peacefully.
These represent cases that each happened recently in 2009 or after, which is after doctors became reinterested in this phenomenon and started studying it. However, there are cases in the historical record as well, and we heard about some of those cases briefly earlier, including going all the way back to the 1200s with Queen Dagmar of Denmark. Those mentions were very brief, but here's a more substantial account from the year 1846. Bathiani writes,
The following early case report by the Berlin physician Rudolf Lubischer is taken from the German biologist Michael Naum's historical case collection. In his 1846 article, Return of the Consciousness of a Madwoman Before Death, Lubischer describes the case of a 44-year-old patient, Ms. Lorenz, who was admitted to his institution. Ms. Lorenz suffered from prolonged states of disorientation and severe delusions. During her inpatient treatment, her condition worsened progressively. She suffered from intense dizziness and amnesia and was very confused. She claimed to be 22 years old, never to have had a family. The 44-year-old was in fact the widowed mother of 5, and was convinced that her mother had been dead for 50 years. A few months after her admission, her doctors noted a slight improvement in her dizziness and fainting spells. However, Ms. Lawrence remained severely confused and clung to her delusional ideas. In due course, her mental state continued to deteriorate, and her dizziness and fainting spells increased once again. After another bout in late September 1845, she was profoundly confused for a period of some 4 months. She eventually died in February 1846. However, Lubischer notes in his case report that as death approached, Lorenz suddenly woke up to a free and clear consciousness. She is once again aware of the entire past, no longer confuses her surroundings as before, shows deep and heartfelt recognition for the attention she receives, apologizes for being a burden as a result of her uncleanliness, and dies in the full knowledge that such a miserable existence could be of no more use to the world. The posthumous autopsy of Lorenz's brain revealed that she had suffered from profound, severe brain damage. A sharp bone fragment of 1 to 2 centimeters in length had caused chronic meningitis on the inside of the cranium, as well as a softening of cystic appearance to the cerebral membrane. Furthermore, blistery deposits in several brain areas, as well as edema in the cerebral ventricles, were found. Lubischer's notes on this diagnosis therefore say, "We find a brain disease that, according to other pathological experience, eliminates higher cognitive functioning, and which in fact had that effect for years, with little variation in mental activity. And we find the return of mental activity to its earlier integrity under unchanged organic conditions, which, at least according to the anatomical diagnosis, did not allow for the assumption of significant regeneration."
So in this case, the woman's madness was caused by a sharp bone fragment that had caused her to have chronic meningitis, or infection and inflammation of the membranes and fluids around the brain. Finally, to give one more case study, here's an account from 1922, and this is a particularly famous one. Bathiani writes,
One of the more prominent cases of terminal lucidity, also from Michael Naum's case collection and frequently discussed in literature, is that of Anna Katarina Emmer, usually simply known as Kata. Kata, born on May 30th, 1895, began suffering from prolonged seizures at the age of 6 weeks and only learned to walk at the age of 2.5 years. At the age of 6, on June 17th, 1901, she was admitted to the psychiatric ward at Hefata in Tresa, Hesse, Germany, where she spent the remainder of her life until her death on March 1st, 1922. The following is from her case file. Kata was a born idiot and never learned to speak a word. She stared at some random spot for hours or fidgeted for hours on end. She gobbled food, excreted, emitted an animal cry, and slept. We have not observed any other stirrings of life on her part in all those long years. Never did we notice her participate in the life around her for as much as a second. She also deteriorated physically. One leg had to be amputated, and her infirmity only increased. In the morning of March 1st, 1922, the day of Kata's death, the nurse told her treating physician that it looked like she might soon die, for the girl had been humming to herself for quite a while. The resident physician, Wilhelm Wittneben, gave the following account of Kata's death. As we entered the death chamber, we couldn't believe our eyes and ears. The born idiot, Kata, sang her own death songs.
Where finds the soul her home, her peace? Peace, peace, celestial peace.
Kata sang for half an hour. Her face was spiritual, transfigured. Then she quietly went to sleep. The doctor who, like the nurse, had tears in his eyes, kept saying, "I am before a medical mystery. If required to do so, I can prove by means of a section that Kata's cerebral cortex was utterly destroyed, and that cogitation was anatomically impossible." Kata therefore only appeared not to notice any of the goings-on around her. In fact, she had visibly taken in quite a bit of what took place. For where would she have taken the text and tune of the song if not her surroundings? And she had understood the purport of the song and used it in the decisive hour of her life. It did seem like a miracle. What appeared to be even more of a miracle was that the hitherto utterly mute Kata could suddenly render the song's words clearly and distinctly, even though, caused by numerous onsets of meningitis, such pervasive anatomical changes to the cerebral cortex had occurred that it is not rationally comprehensible how the dying girl could suddenly sing clearly, distinctly, and with comprehension.
Now, I always like it when I can find audio content to help give us a better sense of things, so I went looking for the original hymn in German that Cathay would have been singing, and I found it. Its German title is Wo findet die Seele die Heimat die Ruhe, which means, where does the soul find home, find rest? It was written by the German preacher Franz Ludwig Jorgens and published in 1833. Incidentally, the melody is based on the American song Home Sweet Home. Translated, the first verse of the hymn goes like this: "Oh, where is the home of the soul to be found? Who knows its true shelter where comforts abound? What city of refuge will offer a place that sin cannot enter the soul to disgrace? Nowhere, nowhere do we behold on earth such a city of blessings untold." And here's what it sounds like in German. So that's what Cathay was singing, even though she was born with such severe mental handicaps that she never even learned to use language and thus had never even practiced using her lips, tongue, and vocal cords to make the sounds of articulate speech. Nevertheless, she somehow picked up the song, apparently from her environment, unless she was learning it by ESP, and despite extensive damage to her cerebral cortex, she was able to sing it articulately and use it appropriately at the end of her life with apparent awareness that she was dying. It's easy to understand why this case is so often discussed, and it's a beautiful story to end our main look at cases of terminal lucidity.
And before we go on to our faith and reason perspectives, we'd like to take a moment now to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Margaret B., Michael M., Chris F., Nicholas S., and Nathan A. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. And you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give.
Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by Great Lakes Customs Law, helping importers and individuals with seizures, penalties, and compliance with U.S. Customs matters throughout the United States. Visit GreatLakesCustomsLaw.com.
So, Jimmy, where do we go from here?
Normally at this point in the show, we'd list the theories that could explain what we reported in our background section. However, the study of terminal lucidity is so new, really only starting in a major way in 2009, that we're not yet close to having solved this mystery. Bettinelli reports that as of January 2023, no more than a dozen papers had been published in scientific and medical journals, so we're in very early days of the research into TL. As a result, we won't be focusing primarily on theories in this episode. Instead, we'll continue to describe what is known about the phenomenon, although then we will return to the theoretical perspective when we discuss what TL may say about the mind-body relationship and whether materialism or dualism is true.
All right, so then what can we say about terminal lucidity from the faith perspective?
The faith doesn't really have any position on terminal lucidity. The Bible does report incidents of people like patriarchs making prophetic speeches just before their deaths, but that's a different phenomenon that we can talk about in future episodes. None of the biblical patriarchs or other figures in the Bible were demented at the times of their deaths, and so none had a sudden return of lucidity right before they died. There may have been cases of TL reported in Christian history, but not in a way that caused the church to pronounce on them, at least not as far as I know. So it appears that terminal lucidity is a matter that the faith leaves purely to science to figure out, although TL may very well provide evidence for an afterlife, though we'll hear about that in the reason perspective rather than the faith perspective.
What can we say about terminal lucidity from the reason perspective then? How common is it?
This is something that we don't really know the answer to yet, but the potential population that might experience TL is quite large. Alexander Bettinelli writes,
In the United States alone, some 8 to 9 million people suffer from dementia, which roughly corresponds to the population of New York City. There are some 50 million sufferers worldwide, with 10 million newly diagnosed cases per year. Not to mention other neurological diseases or cognitive impairments sustained in the course of brain tumors, strokes, or accidents.
So there are tens of millions of people who might experience TL before their deaths. The question is, what percentage of those people will? And that's something we really don't know the answer to. Just looking back at reported cases doesn't tell you how common such cases are. One way of trying to get a little bit of a handle on the issue is by asking healthcare providers whether they've seen terminal lucidity in their patients. Bettinelli writes,
In a study recently carried out by the British psychiatrist Peter Fenwick, no fewer than 7 out of 10 caregivers stated that they have, in the course of their work in a hospice, observed cases of unexpected mental clarity in their dying patients. The gold standard, however, to establish how often a medical event occurs is to conduct a so-called prospective study. That is, you do not study events after they occurred, called retrospective study, but carefully observe and follow a predefined group of patients who could, in principle, be candidates for the phenomenon you are looking for, not knowing whether any or how many of these patients would display it. In 2009, Sandy McLeod did just that. He monitored 100 successive deaths in a hospice in New Zealand and found 6 cases of terminal lucidity preceding the patient's death by up to 48 hours. Of these cases, 3 had brain involvement, 4 were acutely delirious, and 1 patient had required high-dosage opioid therapy. In other words, a sizable number of these patients were cognitively impaired due to illness or other physiological factors, and yet they too experienced terminal lucidity.
So based on Sandy McLeod's prospective study, we might estimate that 6% of people may experience TL within 48 hours of their deaths. But this finding has to be considered very preliminary because 100 deaths is a small sample size. There might have been a higher or lower percentage if he looked at more people. And since the deaths all occurred in a single hospice, they may not be representative of other populations, since the hospice may have catered to patients with medical conditions that are common in a particular demographic group in New Zealand, and it may not represent other populations accurately. Also, I should note that the 6% figure needs to be understood correctly because McLeod looked at a sequence of 100 deaths in a hospital. That included both patients with cognitive impairment and those without cognitive impairment. That would mean that 6% of all hospice patients had TL, not that 6% of those with cognitive impairment had TL. If we factor out those patients who were not cognitively impaired, then a considerably higher percentage of patients with cognitive impairment may have experienced TL before their deaths. For example, I've seen a number coming out of the findings of British researcher Peter Finnick that would indicate it's more like 14%, although in his case, I'm not sure whether it's 14% of all deaths or 14% of deaths that involve cognitive impairment.
Does terminal lucidity always happen in the same way?
No, Michael Nahm reports that 2 distinct types of TL have been identified and were identified pretty early on.
As early as 1826, Burdak described 2 distinct ways in which terminal lucidity can manifest. First, the degree of mental derangement can decrease slowly in conjunction with the decline of bodily vitality. Cases of schizophrenia and of affective disorders typically belong to this category, and the process of becoming lucid may take several days or weeks after long years of severe and uninterrupted mental disturbance. Second, full mental clarity can emerge suddenly just before dying. Among modern cases, those involving Alzheimer's disease and brain tumors usually belong to this second category. Here, this return of mental clarity often occurs in the last seconds, minutes, or hours before the patient's death. The most astonishing cases of terminal lucidity concern patients who suffered from severe neurologic diseases such as meningitis, tumors, Alzheimer's disease, or strokes. In short, cases in which there is reason to think that the brain's neuronal circuits were severely impaired or destroyed.
So there are slow onset cases of lucidity, which typically seem to happen with cases of psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia and other affective disorders, meaning mood disorders like depression or mania. And then there are sudden onset cases, which tend to happen with physiological disorders like Alzheimer's, brain tumors, strokes, and so forth. You could explain the former as just gradual improvement and the natural, and as natural psychological healing. But it's much harder to explain the later sudden onset cases that happen with physiological disorders. Bathiani writes,
Clearly, neurons do not regrow and regenerate on a large scale, and certainly not within the short time window when terminal lucidity tends to spontaneously occur. It is therefore indeed extraordinary and remains unexplained how it is possible that these patients manifest a return of the very self-awareness and memories that were presumed erased, and cognitive faculties that were presumed lost shortly before death.
So these are the more interesting cases and the ones that are harder to explain. Based on the most recent research, though, it appears that you can identify several additional categories of TL. Bathiani describes research that he was involved with that looked at a significant number of case histories, and he and his associates identified 4 categories. Category 1 represented cases where there was clear, coherent, and quote-unquote just about normal verbal communication from the patient. Category 2 involved the patient becoming clear and lucid, but the informant wasn't totally sure about the coherence of the verbal communications they got. Category 3 involved the patient becoming clear and lucid, but being described as largely incoherent in verbal communications. And Category 4 involved the patient seeming to become clear and lucid, but they only communicated non-verbally, such as through their gestures or their gaze. So to kind of sum up, in Category 1, they were basically fully normal in the eyes of the reporter. In Category 2, they seemed to be normal, except the reporter wasn't 100% sure that they were fully coherent. In Category 3, they seemed lucid, but the reporter said they were largely incoherent in what they said. And in Category 4, they seemed to be lucid, but only communicated non-verbally.
Let's go through each of those categories in more detail. What can you tell us about Category 1?
This represents 78% of the patients, so a large majority. And the case histories that we read earlier belong to this category, where the patient seemed fully back to normal for a period of time before dying. In fact, they often seem better than normal. Almost 25% of Category 1 experiences involved the patient not only coming back to normal consciousness, but also having increased energy so that they weren't just weak and lying in bed. And the same number involved the patient having an elevated mood. They were very positive and happy, even elated during the period of lucidity. This is a phenomenon that's often associated with other death-related phenomena, including deathbed visions, where people are often very happy at what they're seeing in the vision, and also including near-death experiences, most of which involve positive emotions, although there are also disturbing NDEs like the ones we talked about in episode 292. You can go to mysterious.fm/292 for more on that.
What can you tell us about Category 2 experiences, where the observers weren't sure that the patient's verbal communications were fully coherent?
These represented 8% of the cases, and the reason that the observers weren't sure about how coherent the patient was is because of what the patient was speaking about or who they were speaking to. People who were not physically present, mostly dead people. For example, here's one such experience.
My dad was in a nursing home for half a year. He had severe dementia and could no longer formulate a sentence. He didn't recognize us. On the day he died, however, he knew exactly who I was. He looked at me and started speaking. He said that he knew he would not be much longer in this home. I was not sure what he meant or whether he was healed and wanted to move to his flat again, but he shook his head. He said, "Last night David came and said he would take me home." David was his older brother. He had died 4 weeks before. We had told my dad once, but never mentioned it again as we were sure that he had not understood. When Dad talked about his beloved David, I bit my lip so that I didn't cry right there and then. But Dad looked so happy, so joyous. He really looked forward to leaving the nursing home. Dad died that very night.
So in this case, the person's father had experienced a vision of his deceased brother David, who said that he would be taking him home soon. People in this category also report seeing things other than people that they find very beautiful, as in this example.
As my father breathed his last, he suddenly opened his eyes and asked, "Did you see that? This is breathtakingly beautiful. Wow." Without sounding too woo-woo, I am certain what he saw was his soul departing.
When it comes to how to evaluate Category 2 experiences, Bathiani writes,
It can be rather difficult to decide whether to interpret such cases as mere hallucinations and terminal deliria, especially since terminal delirium doesn't tend to be associated with the peaceful and positive emotions that are reported in the vast majority of these cases. Additionally, I have yet to come across cases in this category where, instead of relating visions of deceased relatives or religious themes, patients describe entirely nonsensical experiential visions or hallucinations of living persons. Hence, in view of their somewhat peculiar profile, it might be prudent to just let these reports stand for now, without prematurely writing all of them off as mere hallucinations or delusions.
From a scientific perspective, I understand why Bettinelli says that, and I agree. We need to be very conservative in the conclusions we draw scientifically. However, I'll also tell you my personal opinion. I think that most of these cases are ultimately the same thing as Category 1 experiences. The reason is that the patients in them seem to be having another known death-related phenomenon. They're seeing deathbed visions, or DBVs. We'll talk about DBVs in a future episode, but for now, I just note that dying people often report seeing deceased friends and relatives coming to take them to the next world, or they see religious figures like angels who are there to do the same thing. They often see beautiful sights like light and hear beautiful music. And as Bettinelli notes, this is all very different from ordinary pathological hallucinations. These patients are peaceful and happy, and their experiences involve deceased relatives and religious themes. They don't involve nightmarish imagery and negative emotions like pathological hallucinations, and they don't just involve random people and things, but specific people and things. So, as we'll discuss in a future episode, I conclude that deathbed visions are authentic experiences of an invisible reality. And so, I consider Category 2 cases of terminal lucidity to be the same thing as Category 1 experiences. The person is back to a state of lucid mental functioning. It's just that they're also reporting a deathbed vision at the same time. I can't prove that scientifically, but it's my personal opinion of these. So if we take the 78% of experiences that are Category 1 and add to them the 8% that are Category 2, then that would mean that 86% of experiences involve the person being basically back to full mental function.
What about Category 3, where the observer thought the person was being incoherent in their verbal communications?
Category 3 experiences were the least common of the 4 types. They represented only 3% of the sample. Bettinelli writes,
Next, there was a relatively small group where those present were quite sure that what the patients were saying was not coherent at all. From the reports, it seems as if most of these patients were obviously hallucinating. One patient, for instance, believed that a large oak tree had grown in her room overnight. Another insisted on wearing new boots. She was barefoot in bed and wasn't sure whether she liked wearing them. But now that she had them, thought she might as well go for a walk.
Bettinelli says that it's tempting to interpret at least some of these communications as symbolic. That is, they actually are coherent communications, but they're expressed in symbolic terms that don't correspond to what the living witnesses can see. And he says that several of their informants, particularly the personnel who worked in hospices, also endorsed this symbolic view.
What would the things the patients reported symbolize?
Well, they might be things the patient is seeing in a deathbed vision. For example, in DBVs and in near-death experiences, people often report seeing a beautiful realm, often one with a natural setting, like a beautiful park, which is presumably symbolic of the afterlife. And so maybe the patient who saw the tree was having an experience of this type, where the park-like environment was being merged in with their own surroundings in the hospice room. And maybe the woman who insisted that she was wearing new boots was experiencing a symbol of being ready to go on a journey into the next life, which was represented by the boots. She wasn't sure if she liked the boots, but she thought that she might as well go for a walk in them, perhaps signifying that she wasn't sure if she wanted to die yet, but she was prepared for the afterlife and thought she might as well proceed.
What do you make of these possibilities?
I can't rule them out. It's possible that this imagery is symbolic bleed-through from an accurate deathbed vision. But I think I'm somewhat more cautious on this point than Bettinelli. Now, to be fair, he doesn't say that he thinks these communications are symbolic. He says it's tempting to view some of them as symbolic, and I can agree with that. But I would not say that I'm as confident that many of them are symbolic. In the first place, I need to know more about these communications, and in the second place, pathological hallucinations do occur, so I don't want to discount the possibility that many of them are pathological hallucinations. Still, as Bettinelli points out, this is a very small set of the sample, only 3%, so we'd need a significantly larger collection of them to really understand what's going on with this category.
Then what about the final type of terminal lucidity on this scale, category 4?
These represent 11% of the sample, and Bettinelli explains what they involve.
Finally, there was a group about which respondents reported that they had the clear impression that patients were lucid, but no verbal communication took place. In some of these cases, the lack of verbal communication might have been a result of physiological conditions, such as facial paralysis resulting from stroke or an oxygen mask. In a number of cases, however, the respondents had the clear impression that meaningful nonverbal communication with the patient had occurred, though it often was difficult to decide from the available descriptions whether the eye contact, say, or the holding and squeezing of a hand, or stroking of the back of the hand, represent terminal lucidity in each and every one of these cases.
And I'd agree with that. In some cases, the patient suddenly becomes alert, turned and looked a loved one right in the eye, and then reached out and grabbed their hand and squeezed it, which is a clear sign of lucidity and meaningful nonverbal communication, and which seems like the person is fully back. But in other cases, it wasn't fully clear that the patient had all their mental faculties back since they couldn't talk.
For those who could talk, what did they talk about? What was the topic of conversation? Were they aware of their impending deaths?
Bettinelli writes,
The next question to explore is what the patients talked about, if indeed they communicated verbally. Further analysis of these reports show a result I hadn't initially anticipated. Many indicated that the patient was aware that he or she had been in a cognitively impaired state before the lucid episode, and that a significant number of patients seemed to know that their lucid time window was not going to last. Some even spoke explicitly about their impending death and used the remaining time to bid farewell to their family, friends, and caregivers. These findings, incidentally, again coincide with the results obtained by the research group around Peter Fenwick, and also showed that a large number of patients who were part of this study had accurate forebodings of their impending death. Altogether, there were 4 recurring conversation topics reported. 1. Reminiscing with family members. 2. Awareness of impending death. 3. Preparations and last wishes, quote-unquote unfinished business. And 4. Occasionally, bodily concerns such as hunger or thirst. In the majority of cases, more than one of these topics was discussed during the lucid episode.
Communications included things like messages for family members, like, tell my sister, who also has dementia, that I'll be waiting for her on the other side. Or they could be about making arrangements for one's own passing, like, give those books of mine to my colleague unless you want to keep them. And here is a particularly beautiful exchange.
As my grandmother lay in her deathbed, my grandfather sat beside her. The two of them had been married for more than 60 years. And now this loving husband sat next to her sickbed, shaking with grief. He was also confused, because she had for the first time recognized him that day, and deeply saddened because the doctors were telling us that my grandmother was dying. Tears ran down their cheeks, and even the nurse, who occasionally entered the room quietly to check on us, struggled to hold back her tears. My grandfather said, "I love you," sobbing uncontrollably. My grandmother looked at him and said something wonderful. "Take care of our garden as a sign of our love." My grandparents had a beautiful little garden, which my grandmother always lovingly tended as long as she was able to. My grandfather sat in the garden on warm summer months and read to her from the newspaper, or the two of them talked while she did her gardening. The garden thus meant a lot to them, and her good advice to my grandfather to channel his love and grief for her into the garden was indeed going to work miracles. My grandfather truly came into bloom, just like the garden he tended.
What do we know about who has terminal lucidity? Are there any particular demographic characteristics they have?
There are a few. Bettinelli's study only looked at people who'd been diagnosed with cognitive impairment, but his sample covered quite a range of ages. The youngest person he found who had TL was only 8 years old, and the oldest person was 100 years old. However, those are the extremes, not the averages. Basically, 20% of the sample was younger than 65 years old, and 80% of it was more than 65 years old, which makes sense because older people have a higher risk of severe cognitive impairment than younger people do. So it's natural that older people would have terminal lucidity more often than younger people for just that reason. Also, as you'd expect, Bettinelli found more women experiencing TL than men because women live longer than men on average. So they're more likely to survive to an age where cognitive impairment happens, and thus they're more likely to have terminal lucidity. But assuming that a person does have cognitive impairment, it doesn't seem that sex plays a role in who gets to have terminal lucidity. It seems to be, if you do have it, it seems to be equal opportunity for men and women, at least as far as I'm aware.
And how long does terminal lucidity last when it happens?
It can last for minutes, hours, or even more than a day. In Bettinelli's sample, about 10% of cases lasted less than 10 minutes. About 80% of cases lasted between 10 minutes and a full day, and about 10% of cases lasted longer than a full day.
How close does terminal lucidity happen to death? Once it happens, how long is the person likely to live?
It varies considerably. In Bettinelli's case collection, about a third of patients, so around 33%, died less than 2 hours after the lucid episode. Another third, so another 33%, died between 2 and 24 hours after the event. So that's 2/3 of patients die within a day. A fifth, or 20%, died between 2 and 3 days afterwards. In less than 10% of cases, the person died 4 to 7 days later, and only in 5% of cases did the person last more than 8 days. The takeaway I derive from that is if your loved one experiences an episode of terminal lucidity, make the most of it. There is an 80% chance the episode will last between 10 minutes and 1 day, and there's a 33% chance they'll be dead in 2 hours and a 2/3 chance they'll be dead within a day. So strike while the iron is hot.
That final 5% of cases where the person survived more than 8 days would be cases of the related phenomenon we discussed earlier, paradoxical lucidity, where death is not imminent when the lucidity happens. Is there any way to tell which is going to happen, whether you're looking at a case of paradoxical lucidity or a case of terminal lucidity?
Unfortunately, we really don't have such a way right now. Bettinelli writes,
One occasionally hears such stories of what appear to be examples of paradoxical lucidity. As this phenomenon is even less studied than terminal lucidity, we know of no unique indicators to differentiate the two. In other words, there is currently no way of telling whether the unexpected lucid episode of a dementia patient is a precursor to his or her death. We don't know.
So once again, strike while the iron is hot. If your loved one with cognitive impairment suddenly becomes lucid, act now, because you can't count on this being paradoxical lucidity. In only 5% or 1 in 20 cases will the person live more than a week. Expect it to be terminal lucidity and make the most of the time you have.
Is there any way of predicting when terminal lucidity will happen, if it's going to happen? Are there any triggers that tend to bring it on?
This was something that Bettinelli and his associates really thought about and looked into. He writes,
We wondered whether the occurrence of terminal lucidity was particularly frequent at specific times of the day. It is common knowledge that, particularly among older people, cognitive performance is more closely aligned to circadian rhythms. So perhaps this was also a factor at play here? Or were there changes in medication? a one-size-fits-all trigger or mechanism wasn't particularly likely to be at play in terminal lucidity, since it occurs in the course of a wide range of conditions. However, exactly because this phenomenon had not been systematically investigated, it seemed prudent to follow every conceivable lead, no matter how far-fetched, unlikely, or improbable. These might include any change in the patient's daily routine, possibly certain foods or beverages, weather conditions, psychological factors such as visits from certain persons, or discussing certain subjects in the presence of the patient, among other potential factors.
However, the results they got in asking people about cases of terminal lucidity didn't suggest anything in particular other than the approach of death. In 2 cases, the respondents suggested that the lucidity might be connected with discontinuing a medication. In 2 cases, they suggested it might be connected with changing the healthcare setting of the patient, like moving from a hospital to a hospice. But that's a tiny number of suggestions out of a much larger sample size. Some respondents suggested that the lucidity might be associated with the presence of visitors, like family or friends, but that's totally ambiguous. It could be that the visitors caused the terminal lucidity to happen, or it could be that the terminal lucidity was only noticed because visitors were there to see it. So that doesn't tell us anything. Ultimately, the only consistent indicator was that the person was going to die within the next 7 days, which happened in 95% of the cases where lucidity returned.
How do people react when one of their relatives suddenly becomes terminally lucid?
They're often very surprised because many people don't know about this phenomenon. They don't realize it's a possibility. However, they generally regard it as a very positive experience. Here are some examples that Bathiani cites.
My mother's lucidity before dying was a wonderful gift, which made her passing so much easier to accept. I also saw her old loving self in the conversations we had. After so much emotional hardship with dementia, it was good to know she was leaving our reality as herself.
It was wonderful to have those final moments and hours with them, to have all the pain and suffering they endured disappear, if only for that brief moment in time. It helps so much with the grieving process.
At first surprise with the enlightening feeling, an opportunity to say and hear something important, very emotional and rewarding experience.
The last bit of communication brought all of us a lot of peace and acceptance of our life conditions. I definitely cherish those moments when I remember that I was the last person to interact with her. My name was the last word she spoke, and the way I was able to be with her throughout her illness, no regrets.
Despite reactions like this, not everyone is fully positive about the experience. As I mentioned, some people can be quite confused when TL happens and they don't know what to make of it. And they may even feel afterwards like they can't talk to anyone about what happened, which can make them feel frustrated. Also, it can throw a wrench in their own personal emotions. When a loved one is suffering and getting near death, there can come a point where you, the living, are just ready for the loved one to die so that they won't have to suffer anymore. I know I got to that point when my wife Renee was dying from cancer. At a certain point, I was ready for it to be over, for her to leave all this intense suffering behind and go to heaven. So imagine that you've experienced years of a loved one being cognitively impaired, slowly fading away, physically deteriorating. You've accepted what's happening to them and you're ready for them to pass. The doctors tell you they're about to pass. And then suddenly they're awake and alert and they have lots of energy and happiness, and it seems like now they're nowhere near death. That could be very confusing, and it could throw your emotions and your acceptance of their coming death into turmoil. Part of you is elated to see them again, but now you don't know what's happening or what to expect. You may even think, oh, the doctors were wrong and that your relative is not going to die. And then after this sudden flash of hope, your relative is dead anyway the next day, which would be a crushing disappointment if you didn't know that lucidity tends to return right before death. Then there are the people who didn't make it to the hospital or healthcare facility in time when a relative became terminally lucid. And Everyone else in the family got to say goodbye in that brief window, but they didn't. And they can feel cheated and betrayed by these circumstances. They can feel like they missed out on something precious.
What about the cases of people who are hoping that their loved one becomes terminally lucid so they can say goodbye, but then the person doesn't become lucid and passes on?
These people can also feel very disappointed if they have heard of TL and they're hoping that their loved one becomes lucid, but it doesn't happen. You know, their relative never became mentally clear again just before they died, and their survivors can feel cheated and betrayed by hope. You know, why do other people's relatives get to become lucid and mine didn't? This is a powerful reason why we should not raise hopes too high about whether a person will become terminally lucid. Yes, it can happen, but it doesn't happen in the majority of cases, so look on it as an unexpected blessing if it does, but don't feel bad if it doesn't.
That's how I feel about with my mom. She never became terminally lucid, but I'm glad that some people get that.
Yeah.
So let's return to the issue we began with, whether the brain actually generates consciousness the way materialism holds it does, or whether consciousness is independent of the brain as substance dualism holds. Does terminal lucidity shed any light on this question?
It appears that it does, at least some light. To set us up for this issue, let's consider a few different models for how the mind may relate to the brain. On the materialist view, the brain generates the mind the way an electrical generator generates electricity. If the generator turns off, there's no more electricity, and if the brain shuts off, there's no more mind. But there are other ways of conceptualizing how the two may be related. Earlier, we heard one model that compared the relationship of the mind and the brain to the relationship between a poet and the pencil he uses to write. The poet needs the pencil to write, but if the pencil breaks, the poet still exists, and he may start writing poems in some other way without a pencil, such as mentally. Thus, when our brains stop working at the end of our life, we would continue to exist and to have conscious experiences without our brain. I took that example from Alexander Bathiany's book, and he has another comparison that I also think is helpful, though I've modified it a little bit. Suppose that the Earth, our sister planet the Moon, and the Sun were permanently aligned so that the Moon was always producing an eclipse at a particular spot on Earth. So there's just a permanent eclipse. You look up in the sky and you always see the moon blocking out the sun. So you live under the spot of totality. Well, for all your history, you just see this big black circle in the sky with a bunch of glowing filaments peeking out around it from the halo of the sun behind the moon. If that was your only experience and you were formulating science based on those observations, then you wouldn't know about the sun at all. You'd just be aware of the moon, which you'd think of as a black circle, and you might theorize that the moon produces those bright filaments streaming out from its edges. But then, if one day the moon starts to move out of that position, you could then see the sun and realize that you'd always observed two objects, not the one you thought, and that it was the sun that generates the glowing filaments you thought the moon produced. In this way, you could disentangle the sun from the moon and explain the differences of the phenomena that you had always witnessed. Well, that's one of the proposals here. In life, the brain and the mind are normally locked together the way the moon and the sun would be on this scenario. But in extreme cases, such as at the end of life, the brain and the mind start to become disentangled. And this is what could be responsible for terminal lucidity. The mind is no longer relying on the structures that it normally uses in the brain, and it's acting in another way. It's acting independently. Another way to think about the relationship between the mind and the brain is to conceive of the brain as a transducer of the mind. A transducer converts one type of energy to another, like radios convert radio waves into sound that our ears can pick up, or like our ears convert sound into neurochemical signals that go to our brains. In fact, all of our physical senses are transducers that convert sensory information into electrochemical signals that go to the brain. So what if the brain itself is a transducer? that communicate sensory information about the world to the mind. And that then takes signals from the mind and channels them as messages through our nervous system to our muscles so that we can navigate and survive the environment we live in. Well, if you mess up a transducer so that it doesn't work normally, it will interfere with how well it transduces. Like if you mess with an old-style radio, you may get fuzzy reception. And in the same way, if your brain gets a tumor that causes dementia, it won't transmit signals to and from the mind the way it should. Finally, another way to think about the brain is that it functions as a filter. In order to survive our environment here on Earth, we need to be focused on the details of our immediate environment, at least the important details. I mean, imagine what it would be like if we suddenly were equally aware of everything that's happening all over the world at once. We'd be paralyzed by an overload of information. And the same thing would be true if we were aware of what's happening in other spiritual worlds around us too. So we need a filter to allow us to function in our environment. And one proposal is that's what our brain is doing for us. It's filtering out all the stuff that's not immediately relevant to our survival. And there's even good evidence that points in this direction because that filtering is precisely what our subconscious mind does for us. It sorts through all the reams of sensory information we have coming in at any given moment, and it only forwards up to our conscious attention the things that we really need to know. That's why we're not aware of our heartbeats normally. But we suddenly become aware of them if they skip a beat or get into some kind of abnormal rhythm. If our heart's beating normally, our subconscious tends to filter it out as background noise. But if something weird happens that could affect our survival, it alerts our conscious mind. Well, one proposal, if you want to say, okay, our subconscious mind is working in our brain and this is what our subconscious mind does, then one proposal is that's what the brain does in general. It serves as a filter to keep us focused on surviving here on Earth. And if the filter gets clogged up, it may filter out too much information. Like if you don't replace the filter in a coffee machine, the coffee won't come out right because the filter gets dirty and it doesn't filter properly anymore. And maybe that's what's happening with something like Alzheimer's disease. The person's mental filter isn't working right, so they don't think right. But then when our brains start breaking down and we're no longer trying to survive on Earth, we may get an unfiltered view of reality. At least these are some of the possibilities of how the brain and mind could relate. So you can see that materialism and its idea of the brain as generator is not the only model out there.
These are interesting models to consider, but is there any way to decide between them on an evidential basis?
This is a subject we'll be talking about much more in future episodes, but to keep us focused on terminal lucidity, I think that terminal lucidity tends to point to one of the non-generator models better than it points to the generator model. For example, remember the case of Mrs. D that we discussed at the beginning of the show? She was initially a nice woman, but then got Alzheimer's and started striking nurses and fellow patients. And one author used this to argue that her old self had been permanently erased, that she ceased to exist due to the devastating effects of this disease on her brain. But as Bathiani notes, if a person's old self returns after an absence, like when a person goes to sleep, gets drunk or high, or gets a brain tumor that's then removed, then we don't regard their true self as having been destroyed. There was just a temporary interruption of normal mental function and their true self was still there. Well, it doesn't matter how long that interruption is. It might be for years. But terminal lucidity suggests that even in dementia cases like Mrs. D, the true self is still there, and sometimes it comes out and manifests just before death. That suggests that we can't regard long-term cases of mental impairment as a sign that the person's true self no longer exists. And that casts doubt on the idea that the brain is a generator of consciousness, because now the argument for that position is missing a key piece of evidence that was used to support it.
How does that fit with your initial proposal that terminal lucidity might have a strictly physical cause, as a kind of physical reflex where the body's trying to rally to survive and it brings normal consciousness back online?
Well, I always try to consider naturalistic mainstream scientific explanations first, things that fit with the common picture of the scientific picture of the world. And then when those don't work out, I become confident in proposing different explanations that don't fit the common view of things. Partly, this is a matter of epistemology, or the philosophy of how we know things, the theory of knowledge. We know that current science is capable of explaining large swaths of what we see in the world. So if we can think of a way that's in harmony with mainstream science to explain something, then we shouldn't leap to a conclusion that modern science wouldn't explain. Also, this approach is partly a matter of apologetic strategy. There are places where modern science does not explain things. There are miracles. I don't want to waste time and energy arguing about something that goes beyond conventional science unless I have a clear, solid basis for it. So when I initially began considering terminal lucidity, I thought of something in terms of conventional science that might explain it. And I didn't have any counter evidence, so I didn't leap to the proposal that terminal lucidity must involve a more than material cause. Nevertheless, I've remained open to that possibility, and although I still can't prove that it has a more than material cause, in part because research is still in its infancy, after studying the phenomenon more closely, I think there are two reasons that point in the direction of consciousness having a more than material cause in cases of terminal lucidity.
Then let's look at both of those reasons. What's the first one?
It's the diversity of the different types of medical conditions that terminal lucidity happens in. Bettinelli explains,
we also found that the TL was not limited to specific types of neurological disorders or diagnoses. While more than half of the case reports we received concerned dementia patients, we also received case reports of patients with brain tumors, traumatic brain injuries, cognitive impairment after strokes, and rather less specific, severe cognitive impairment without further designator.
He also says,
it is the fact that TL occurs in an enormously wide variety of underlying neurological disorders. Dementia without specifier, Alzheimer's, Lewy body dementia, cardiovascular dementia, AIDS-related dementia, brain abscesses, stroke, primary or secondary brain tumors, late effects of bacterial meningitis, traumatic brain injury, etc. Next to its defining feature, the spontaneous and unexpected return of mental lucidity, i.e. the old self, the common denominator of TL episodes is the fact that they take place close to the patient's death. Otherwise, the physiological underpinnings of one case seem to have very little in common with the other.
And that's important. Bettinelli just named 10 different medical conditions that cause cognitive impairment, and that's not even all of them. But they work differently. A stroke stops you from thinking properly for different reasons than a brain tumor does, and a brain tumor stops you from thinking properly for different reasons than Alzheimer's does, and so on. Well, it's one thing to propose that we all have some kind of last-minute rallying reflex that could temporarily reverse the cognitive effects of one medical condition that works one way, but it's much harder to propose that we have a last-minute reflex that can reverse the effects of more than 10 medical conditions that work in different ways, or that we have more than 10 last-minute rallying reflexes, each one of which undoes the effect of one condition that impairs cognition. So it's just much harder to explain terminal lucidity in terms of a purely physical rallying reflex, given that it works across all these different conditions that have different mechanisms of action. And that points us in the direction of consciousness not being purely physical.
You said there was a second reason you think terminal lucidity points toward consciousness being more than physical. What's the second reason?
It has to do with the models we talked about regarding the mind-body relationship and with how terminal lucidity fits with other death-related phenomena such as deathbed visions and near-death experiences. let's start with the materialistic brain as generator model of consciousness. If that model is correct, then you would not expect a person's consciousness to improve at all as their body fails. So you can make a prediction on the generator model. The hypothesis would be that you should not see mental function improve with the approach of death, either for those with cognitive impairment or for those without it. On the other hand, suppose the brain is acting like a filter for consciousness, or even just that the brain slows down what consciousness can otherwise do, so that it's a kind of impediment or brake, even if it's not a filter per se. Well, on models like this, you can also make a prediction. You would predict that as death gets nearer and the filter or brake stops working correctly, then the person's consciousness will improve because it's no longer being impeded. So what do we find in cases of terminal lucidity? Not only do we find cognitive function does improve, we also find that the person may even experience unusual extra energy, alertness, and elevated mood. But even without that, the generator model does not predict terminal lucidity, while the other models do.
You said that this line of argument also has to do with how terminal lucidity fits with other death-related phenomena. What did you mean?
Well, let's make a couple more predictions. Suppose, for the moment, X hypothesize that consciousness does survive death and that it survives in a non-physical world or aspect of reality. Okay, well, if the generator model is correct, then we have a real problem explaining how that happens. I mean, how does consciousness survive in a non-physical realm if it's generated by a physical brain that's no longer working? But now suppose that the brain is a filter or brake on what consciousness can otherwise do. In that case, as death approaches and the brain is breaking down, then we'd expect to see the mind becoming aware of non-physical things. It's starting to get an unfiltered or unimpeded view of the world. And then, when physical death actually happens, it should get a completely unfiltered, unimpeded view of the world in which it finds itself. So we would expect things like expanding awareness and possibly even increased processing power, meaning faster thought and more intelligence could be possible. The generator would not predict those things. Indeed, the generator would have trouble explaining the survival of consciousness at all. But the other views would predict expanded awareness both before and after death, as well as other possible improvements to consciousness in the post-death state.
So what do we find when we compare terminal lucidity to other forms of death-related phenomena?
We find both of those things. Before death, many people experience expanded awareness that includes aspects of the non-physical world. These are the deathbed visions that we'll talk about in a future episode. And they are the ones that occur in Category 2 cases of terminal lucidity that we discussed earlier. As we'll hear in the future, deathbed visions often contain accurate information about the person or about others that the person has no way of knowing, which is evidence that they aren't just hallucinations, but are accurate perceptions of the world. Then, when we look at near-death experiences, we find common reports of an even greater awareness and abilities. Near-death experiencers commonly report perceiving a non-physical realm that we don't normally have perceptual access to, so that would be expanded awareness. And near-death experiencers commonly report having an altered perception of time, where they can think blindingly fast. They commonly report having a life review, where they review everything they did in their entire life and how it affected other people. And they report receiving vast quantities of information that they were unable to retain upon being brought back to life. So we see a kind of trajectory between terminal lucidity, deathbed visions, and near-death experiences, where a person's awareness and mental abilities grow across each type of experience. You get some extra restored ability compared to what you previously had with terminal lucidity. You get more ability with deathbed visions, and you get the whole enchilada with near-death experiences. At least that's what the experiencers report happening. Well, substance dualism models that view the brain as a filter or brake would predict exactly these things. whereas the materialistic generator model seems to directly contradict them. So I would say that this is a second major reason why terminal lucidity, especially in conjunction with other death-related phenomena, points toward substance dualism rather than materialism.
What do skeptics say about all this?
I haven't found skeptics responding to these arguments, and I can't speak on their behalf, but I have seen cases where skeptics have acknowledged bafflement at terminal lucidity, where it shakes them a bit. For example, writing in Scientific American, New Zealand skeptic Professor Jesse Baring wrote,
I'm as sworn to radical rationalism as the next neo-Darwinian materialist. That said, over the years I've had to quarantine, for lack of a better word, a few anomalous personal experiences that have stubbornly defied my own logical understanding of them. When my mother died in early 2000, we had a final farewell that some researchers might consider paranormal. At the time, it did strike me as remarkable, and after all these years, I still can't talk about it without getting emotional. The night before she died at the age of 54, after a long battle with ovarian cancer, I was sleeping in my mother's bedroom alongside her. The truth was that I'd already grieved her loss a few days earlier, from the moment she lapsed into what the hospice nurses had assured us was an irretrievable coma. So at this point, waiting for her body to expire as a physical machine wasn't as difficult as the loss of her beforehand, which is when I'd completely broken down. It had all happened so quickly, and I suppose being young and in denial about how imminent her death really was, I hadn't actually gotten around to telling her how very grateful I was to have had her as my mom and how much I loved her. But then, around 3 a.m., I awoke to find her reaching her hand out to me, and she seemed very much aware. She was too weak to talk, but her eyes communicated all. We spent about 5 minutes holding hands, me sobbing, kissing her cheeks, telling her everything I'd meant to say before but hadn't. Soon she closed her eyes again, this time for good. She died the next day. I didn't quite see the experience as supernatural when it happened, and I'm not sure I do today either. But I also didn't have a name for the experience then. In fact, one didn't even exist. It does now, terminal lucidity. And in their extensive literature review on the subject, not an easy task, given that terminal lucidity couldn't be used as a search term prior to that first 2009 article, Michael Naum and Bruce Grayson found a total of 81 references to similar cases reported by 51 different authors. 19th century physicians and psychiatrists, they point out, wrote most of these accounts. By the 20th century, they speculate, doctors simply stopped reporting these incidents altogether because they failed to jive with contemporary scientific materialism. Yet even if terminal lucidity is a genuine phenomenon, who's to say there isn't a logical scientific explanation, one involving some unknown brain physiology? Naum and Grayson don't discount this possibility entirely, but for cases involving obvious brain damage, such as strokes, tumors, advanced Alzheimer's disease, that should render the patient all but vegetative, not functioning normally, it's a genuine medical mystery. According to the authors, terminal lucidity also isn't all just in the perceiver's head. Rather, they write, it seems to be more common than usually assumed and reflects more than just a collection of anecdotes that on closer scrutiny emerge as wishful thinking. This then, to them, leaves open the possibility of something more spiritually significant, with the transcendental subject, that is, the soul, loosening itself from the physical substrate of the brain as death approaches, and being able to enter usually hidden realms. I remain a skeptic. Still, I really don't know how my mother managed those 5 minutes of perfect communion with me, when ostensibly all of her cognitive functions were already lost. Was it her immortal soul? One last firestorm in her dying brain? Honestly, I'm just glad it happened.
I think that's a very honest, open-minded account from someone who is otherwise a skeptic about the soul, and I want to commend Professor Baring for it. At the same time, I would note that it doesn't counter either of the points I made, that it's very hard to propose a physical reflex that would reverse cognitive impairment caused by so many different things just before death, and that the materialistic generator model would not predict either terminal lucidity or what is reported with deathbed visions and near-death experiences, but the filter and break models involving substance dualism would predict exactly those things.
You've noted that research on terminal lucidity is still in its infancy, that there have been very few scientific publications on it. What do you think about the direction of future research?
I think this is something that both Michael Nahm and Alexander Bettinelli have commented on and have good things to say. Here is what Michael Nahm writes.
The potential of terminal lucidity as an avenue of research is unfortunately impeded by its very nature. It occurs largely unexpected in terminally ill patients who, in addition, were often confused or non-responsive before. Such patients cannot easily be made subjects of scientific studies or autopsies for ethical and practical reasons. Hence, it is likely that many accounts of terminal lucidity will remain on the anecdotal level. Nevertheless, as with near-death experiences and other end-of-life experiences, it is feasible to assess the incidence and varieties of terminal lucidity in prospective and retrospective studies. Particularly remarkable cases could be documented as thoroughly as possible from a medical perspective. A specific scale to estimate the unusualness and the degree of the observed lucidity could be developed based on existing scales, as a means to judge the fluctuations of mental coherence and memory. It might even be feasible to advance new forms of therapies to improve the access to autobiographic memories in dementia patients. Although terminal lucidity will most likely remain challenging to study, it offers the potential to contribute to an enhanced understanding of cognition, memory processing, and the nature of the human mind. Quite apart from that, a wider knowledge about the phenomenon and an awareness of its possible occurrence would give those who attend patients the opportunity to optimally relate to a dying person who has been in a non-responsive condition for an extended period, sometimes years. As it is, this unexpected return of mental clarity and memory often comes as a complete surprise, and since it lasts only a short time, relatives and nurses may miss a last chance to communicate with the dying in a meaningful way unless they are properly prepared.
So Nahm sees some fruitful lines of research on terminal lucidity, even though there are difficulties that are also there. Alexander Bettinelli agrees, and he points to something that has been a challenge in near-death experience research, which is the fact that we can't tell exactly when a person's NDE occurs. Does it occur before the person's heart stops, or while the person's heart is stopped, or after their heart is restarted? Since the NDEer can't communicate during the experience, we can't know for sure. Bettinelli writes,
There remains the lingering doubt that we do not know when exactly the NDE occurs, although there are a very few studies that at least provide some indication that apparently some NDEers may have had their NDE at the time when they were clinically dead and underwent CPR. In short, some major uncertainties and weaknesses remain, and we would need to seek further complementary findings to add to the evidential value of the NDE. But here is the crucial point. We no longer have to search for such a complementary and corroborating phenomenon. We already have found it: terminal lucidity. TL, in fact, is beset with none of the weaknesses that beset our NDE data. We know exactly when TL takes place. In contrast to the NDE, TL is observed in real time, live, if you will. And as much as the NDE is a private experience that no one from the outside can have access to, with all uncertainties and ambiguities coming with private experiences, TL is a public event. We only know about it because and when witnesses are present who note and observe the patient's unexpected lucidity near death. The return of cognitive ability, responsive and intelligent speech, and biographical and declarative memory is observed and confirmed by these witnesses. It is the key feature of TL. The findings from TL research thus complement and support our NDE data and vice versa. TL data offer a third-person perspective window, and the NDE data, a first-person perspective on mind at death.
And this echoes the point that I made earlier, which is that we need to consider terminal lucidity in light of other death-related phenomena, such as deathbed visions and near-death experiences.
So, Jimmy, what's your bottom line on this topic?
Terminal lucidity is a fascinating phenomenon. It doesn't happen in the majority of cases of people dying with cognitive impairment, but it does happen in a sizable minority of them. When it happens, it can be a great blessing for the person's loved ones. So, although you can't expect it, you can make the most of it and count it as a fortunate blessing when it does happen. And while it may have a purely natural cause that science will one day discover, terminal lucidity actually seems to point away from the materialistic understanding of how brain and mind relate, and seems to point towards the idea that substance dualism is true and that the mind survives death.
Jimmy, what further resources can we offer to the listener and viewer?
We'll have links to Alexander Bethiany's book Threshold, Terminal Lucidity and the Border of Life and Death, Michael Naum's article on terminal lucidity in the Science Encyclopedia, Michael Naum's paper, Terminal Lucidity in People with Mental Illness and Other Mental Disability, information about Phineas Gage, a recording of the German hymn Wo findet die Seele die Heimat die Ruhe, the German text of the hymn, also the English text, and Jesse Baring's article in Scientific American, One Last Goodbye, The Strange Case of Terminal Lucidity.
And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about terminal lucidity? What might explain it and how it affects people? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @MYS_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/Discord, or calling our Mysterious Feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work in this episode. You can check it out by going to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. While you're there, be sure to help the channel out by liking and subscribing and commenting on the video. Also, be sure to hit the bell notification so that you always get notified when I have a new video. I usually have multiple videos coming out per week now. And I want to say a special thank you to Anna Fontaine for her voiceover work in this episode.
So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going to be talking about a subject that skeptics often ask about, namely, if God does miracles to heal people, why don't people who have limbs amputated ever get them back? Why didn't God do that? Well, it turns out he does. And we'll be telling you the story of one such incident that is extremely well documented, the famous Miracle of Calanda.
Very nice. Folks, be sure to check out the Mysterious World bookstore at mysteriousworldstore.com for links to all the books and videos that Jimmy mentions in the show. Be sure to get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt like I'm wearing in the video, or a mug, or more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/312. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at gradygroupinc.com.
Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.